My guest at this time is Ilan Berman. He's the Senior Vice President at the American Foreign Policy Council. We want to get his insights now as the Trump administration trumpets what it calls a ceasefire in Turkey's aggression against the Kurdish population in northern Syria. Critics say the agreement is little more than a surrender of Kurdish territory. And Ilan, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Well, Vice President Pence says this is a major deal that will end the bloodshed. It was a successful trip for him and the Secretary of State. Others say it hangs the Kurds out to dry, essentially, because it gives the territory that the Turkish government wants to the Turks without a fight. And, of course, they also point out that this could have all been prevented if the president acted a little bit differently not too long ago. So where do we stand? Is this an improvement or a capitulation?
So I think it's a little bit of both. On the political side, it's very clear that the Trump administration, having opened a barn door inadvertently to this Turkish invasion, was doing damage control. And the sanctions that the president authorized earlier this week on the Turkish government and the trip taken by Vice President Mike Pence to negotiate this agreement with the Turks was a scramble by the White House to try to mitigate the damage. And it looks like they were successful. But the question really is, where does that leave sort of the correlation of forces within Syria now that the deal has been struck? As you said, the Turks have gained territory. There is now a buffer zone that extends into Syrian territory that ostensibly will mollify the Turks. But if you look at what the Turks are saying internally, there's quite a lot of Erdogan's base, of the Turkish president's political and ideological base, that saw this as sort of their time to shine, as the start of a larger offensive into Syria to create a greater Turkey. So we have a ceasefire. We have a ceasefire for now, but there are real questions for how long that will hold and whether or not the U.S. interests and American allies are disadvantaged by the new correlation of forces that's going to exist in Syria as a result.
Well, the Kurds obviously see this as their territory. I'm assuming the Syrian government does too, and I'm pretty sure we weren't speaking for Assad here. So where does this leave the Syrians?
You know, I think it's a good question, and the saving grace in this compromise, at least for now, is that Bashar al-Assad and his regime are very weak in Syria. They don't have control over the totality of Syrian territory. That's why Syria needs the Russians and the Iranians both to be militarily involved in the country. So what you have is the Turks stopping short, at least for now, of coming into direct contact with the Syrian military. If there wasn't a ceasefire, if the Turks had continued to push deeper and deeper into Syria, it is a virtual guarantee that they would have come into direct conflict with Syrian forces. That's been averted for now, and I think that's probably the single largest takeaway, at least for the moment, of this ceasefire.
It's almost impossible, I know, to predict what will happen the rest of this week, much less the rest of the month and beyond in this situation. But what do you see happening here? The Turks certainly seem to think that they're in a very good position. The U.S. seems to be happy with where they're leaving things at the moment, and the others in the region aren't necessarily in a position to do much about it. So what do you see?
No, I think that's a good question. And the ceasefire works, at least for the time being, because it checks a lot of boxes. It stops Turkey's forward momentum into Syrian territory. It succeeds in mollifying Russia, for example, because Russia is a sometime partner with the Turks, but it's a strategic ally of the Assad regime, and it prevents the Russians from having to make a hard choice about who they're actually going to back if there is a conflict. It also sets the stage, lays the groundwork for the Syrians and the Turks to work at least parallel to try to secure the ISIS fighters that were on Syrian territory, some of whom have gotten loose as a result of this Turkish offensive. So this is a Band-Aid, to be sure. But the question is, how long will the Band-Aid hold and how big the wound actually is? Because that's going to determine whether the Turks continue moving forward in the not-too-distant future.
We're talking with Ilan Berman of the American Foreign Policy Council. And Ilan, we know from what he said in statements and tweets and on camera that the president's explanation, President Trump, is that ISIS was defeated in his estimation, so it was time to leave. But why is he so eager to lavish praise on Erdogan? We've got a couple of clips here from just today after Vice President Pence made the announcement from Turkey. But here's a little bit of what the president had to say about his Turkish counterpart.
I just want to thank and congratulate, though, President Erdogan. He's a friend of mine, and I'm glad we didn't have a problem because, frankly, he's a hell of a leader, and he's a tough man. He's a strong man, and he did the right thing, and I really appreciate it, and I will appreciate it in the future. He did a terrific thing. He's a leader. He's a leader. He had to make a decision. A lot of people wouldn't have made that decision because they don't know. They ultimately would have made it. But what he did was very smart, and it was great for the people of Turkey, and they're lucky it was him that was making the decision, I will tell you that.
So, Ilan, is this just about stroking Erdogan's ego a little bit so he thinks this is a big deal that he now has to abide by more closely, or is it a matter of the president giving far too much credit to a guy who just inflicted a lot of pain on a lot of people?
Well, it is an effort, certainly by the president, to lavish praise on Erdogan to show him that he did the right thing. But the operative phrase that you heard the president utter was, he's a strong man. Mm-hmm. He is a strong man. The Turkish president is a strong man. He's an authoritarian leader. And in this context where the United States doesn't really have a strategy for Syria, doesn't really have a vision for how they want the Syrian state to pan out in the near future, there is a tendency, there has been a tendency on the part of the White House to take a back seat to strongmen leaders like Recep Erdogan of Turkey, like Vladimir Putin of Russia, who have a very expansive vision for the region. The administration wants to work with these leaders to try to craft some sort of cooperative vision, but because the United States doesn't have a sort of a fulsome idea of what it wants to advocate in the region, it tends to sometimes play a back seat to the vision of other countries. And this is, I think, what happened in Syria.
Last question for you, Ilan. We've got a lot of folks seeing what happened over the past several days here, saying this is going to damage trust in a lot of other countries and other leaders when dealing with the United States. Others say, look, most of these countries are pretty much putting all their eggs in the U.S. basket, so they don't really have much choice but to trust the United States. What do you think's the bigger impact of all this?
Right. No, I think far and away that was the sort of the biggest and the most damaging impact of the president's decision to essentially greenlight Turkish invasion, because this isn't just a conversation about the Kurds, who have served at least in the recent past as reliable American allies in the fight against the Islamic State. But this is also a conversation about American steadfastness in the region writ large. It's a conversation about Jordan and about Israel and about the Gulf states, all of whom are looking at this situation and asking hard questions about how much they can actually count on the United States. I think what we've seen today, the ceasefire, the fact that the U.S. Has worked overtime to try to stabilize a problem that was frankly of its own making, I think that helps a bit in terms of reassurance. But I think the Americans have a lot of work to do in terms of reassuring their allies that we're in it for the long haul.
Ilan, a lot to keep watching. Thanks very much for putting it in perspective for us.
My pleasure.
Ilan Berman, Senior Vice President at the American Foreign Policy Council. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.